Are you resting well tonight? Welcome to Slow Night Ancient Tales. Tonight, we are boarding a night train hurtling through the darkness of 1929. Inside a dimly lit cabin, hiding among the weary passengers, sits a frail boy with a worn cap pulled low and a mysterious young man concealed behind dark glasses. Listen closely to the whispered secrets of two souls running from the shadows of their time, moving inevitably toward the dawn. Let the rhythmic march of the train wheels guide you into a deep, peaceful slumber. The March, 1929. Author Lee Hyo-sok. Published in Joseon Munye, issue number 2, June 1929. Avoiding the bustling crowd of the station at night, he lagged behind others, bought a third-class ticket to Bongcheon, and subtly looked around under his deep hat and black glasses before heading to the waiting room. The youth's demeanor, wrapped in Chinese clothing, was nothing but imposing. Carefully observing the inside of the waiting room, he went to a corner bench and sat down. The night waiting room, ahead of the train time, boiled like a kettle. Conversations, noise, warmth, anxious looks, restless stirring, eternal management, and strict life moved and moved again. Through that confusion, bizarre eyes sparkled endlessly. The fellows dressed like country bumpkins, faded hunting caps, awkward suit jackets, short and tight pants gathered from who knows where, shabby rubber shoes, adorned with cheap gold-rimmed glasses. Their eyes shone sharply to the point of displeasure. To clever him, these awkwardly disguised country bumpkins were not something to fear, but their eyes, shining freshly without fatigue, were a terribly unpleasant and bothersome presence. It was the gaze of a terrifying poisonous snake aiming to block his path and ruin his plans. Yet, this was an ungrateful presence inseparable from his life. His entire life, so to speak, was a chain of fretfulness and anxiety, a life with a family, a wife, and society and laws that protect oneself. That is not his life. Squeezing out wisdom, burning his insides, mustering courage, using strength, a 24-hour day, a 365-day year of adventure and death. This was his life. Thinking of this situation of his in contrast to the surrounding crowd, he became gloomy. I work for the masses, but do they know it? Of course, I don't ask them to know. Would they even guess who I am, what this man in Chinese clothes actually is? Could they look into this anxious, burning heart, and it's not because of a girl? Me, who burns up the blood of boiling youth drop by drop in anxiety and adventure. The countless masses who might even despise it rather than understand it. Those who don't know how the world is turning and don't even try to know. Those who can only think of poverty as a sin from a previous life. Between them and me, there is a gap, an unavoidable abyss. Even in this urgent and tense moment, he felt a bitter emptiness. He felt an unsalvageable, eternal emptiness. Though he had despised the act of thinking all his life, there were moments when he suddenly remembered and reflected like this. However, when he returned to reality, the waiting room, confusion, noise, anxiety, stirring, sparkling eyes, plans, duty, he realized the foolishness of his thoughts and fueled his resolve. Why think so foolishly? Sweep into the crowd and dance. Deceive the shining eyes and plan. Work. Even if you think 10 million times, a thought is just a thought. What great thing has thinking ever accomplished in this world? Even if it has, it's nothing more than the tail end of sacred action. If there were no action in the first place, we would have inevitably starved to death, with no room even to think. Don't boast in the corner of a desk and shout about truth or whatever nonsense. Without a meal, what is a philosopher's head but a dried-up thing? Let's act rather than think. Let's go out. Let's work. Whenever he reached this conclusion, which he always predetermined and arrived at, the light of his resolve was renewed. Train to Bongcheon, Bongcheon train. As the station worker's resounding voice rang through the waiting room, swept up in the noisily moving crowd, he picked up his bag and bravely stood up. Turning around, he attached a mustache under his nose while no one was looking. He pulled his hat down as far as possible, dragged his Chinese clothing as much as he could, and blended into the crowd moving toward the ticket gate. It was a great flow. An unstoppable flow. The great flow of life, that is the absolute flow. The flow extending to the waiting room, the ticket gate, the stairs, the platform, and the train. It was a magnificent flow. Those going to seek, those going to find, those going to plan, Wrapping the great flow of all living people, the night station echoed a tragic symphony. Looking at this living crowd, his courage multiplied 100-fold. Crash into them until sparks fly. The words of his comrade, whom he had parted with at the hall in the morning, felt fresh in his ears again. The train was vigorous with the spirit of departure. Inside, countless faces were lively. Will, determination, creation, faces, 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 faces. Having barely found a seat in the midst of the chaos, he took off his mustache and glasses, and as he looked around at the numerous faces, his gaze rested on a certain face in the opposite corner. It was a very pale, soft, yet slightly strong-looking boy. With a worn-out suit and a deeply pulled cap, he looked exactly like a wandering boy from a movie. It was just that his complexion was too white, tender, and slender. He got up, went in front of the boy, and grabbed his shoulder. The boy, startled as if he would faint, raised his deeply bowed face. He stared straight at him for a long time, then, as if finally relieved, patted his throbbing chest, smiled, and opened his mouth slightly. "Who might you be again? Is there a need to be so surprised?" The young man also showed a smile. "But what brings you here?" The boy, finding the young man's unexpected attire strange, looked him up and down. "I have some business, so I'm going to Bongchon," the young man whispered softly to the boy. "Bongchon?" "Yes, if things go well, I might go further in." The young man, wary of surrounding eyes, trailed off his voice and changed the subject. "Where are you heading like this?" "I don't even know where." The boy's voice suddenly dropped. "What do you mean you don't know where?" "Wherever I reach is where I'm going." At the boy's tearful voice, the young man's face clouded. "Alone?" "Well, I don't know if they're still chasing me." The boy cautiously looked around. "What on earth happened last night?" the young man asked, looking at the boy with a gloomy face, for within this lay the following story. It was the night before. Past 6 in the afternoon, as the city's night began, the inside of the labor lodging house was taking on life. People who had gone to work, people who had wandered the worn-out streets, unable to find a job, people without a house or a temple, all the unfortunate people betrayed by the city swarmed into this crumpled house of the city to seek a night's sleep as soon as the sun set. However, compared to the streets agitated by illuminations, headlights and sirens, this gloomy lodging house in the back alley was deserted as if abandoned. Does a full pocket mean life is rich? Does having a woman mean the world is fun? Soothing their hunger with a single silver coin and securing a night's dream with a thin nickel coin, the night at the lodging house was simple and lonely. Only the sounds of stories and snoring leaking from each room late into the night broke the silent monotony. 6 or 7 total strangers gather in one room. Among them, there is no face-saving, no dignity, no superficially slick manners. Rough and flavorless, but frank and without lies. They don't even know each other's first or last names, but with one word they open their hearts, with 2 words their relationship deepens, and in one night's story they completely unite and harmonize. Room number 7, stuck alone in the northern corner, was now blossoming with stories. In addition to Mr. Yoon and Mr. Hong, who had been staying in that room for several years, there was a man who had been to prison, a young man from the port, and a youth who had been to Russia. All sorts of colorful people had gathered. Mr. Hong fell asleep at first, perhaps tired from day labor, and among the rest, the story began as they passed around the wooden pillow. As the people gathered were diverse, their stories were also of all colors and shapes. Stories of the world, stories of hardship, stories of prison, stories of the port, stories of ships, stories of Russia. Room 7 this night was a miniature of a small world. There was knowledge of the wide world, experience lived through blood, and straightforward recognition. Yoon's story of lunging at a Western-dressed lady on the street in broad daylight, making her faint, and spending 15 days in detention was one of the interesting ones. But the port youth's story of stowing away in a pitch-black hold from Wonsan to Vladivostok without a sip of water, and the story of the youth who had been to Russia, who had participated in a workers' demonstration in some Russian city, singing on the streets and waving a flag, aroused the heat and emotion of the many people. Moreover, the youth's various dissatisfactions and logical explanations gave unity to their scattered knowledge and opened their eyes to things they hadn't thought of. and his powerful conclusion made the listener's blood pound. While the room was thus engrossed in stories, an unfamiliar boy entered. The stories stopped, and the room's attention turned to him. He was a boy with a pale face, wearing an old suit and a deeply pulled cap. He, too, was a pitiful boy who had come seeking a night's rest. A labor lodging house swarming with rough men is no place for a pale, frail boy to come. At an age where even whining for food at home wouldn't be considered out of line for a child of a noble family, at an age where he should be going to school without any worries and focusing only on his studies, the fate of a boy who had no choice but to be pushed by rough waves to seek out the cruel flip side of the world was pitiful at first glance. He looked upright and firm, but his facial features and build were those of a soft and fragile boy. For some reason, he was terrified like a sheep chased by a wild beast, twitching and trembling in anxiety. He was like the pitiful boy from an old tale. Where does the boy come from? When asked, without answering, the boy showed a used lodging admission form and a lodging ticket. An 18-year-old boy without a job, and the reason for his stay was simply that he had nowhere to sleep. Other than that, there were no special details written, but judging from the boy's anxious demeanor and cautious attitude, it was certain that something unusual had happened to him. "Is there something making you anxious?" Even when Russia asked gently, the boy hesitated to answer, pulling his deeply worn hat even deeper. When whispering sounds were heard from outside and the wind suddenly brushed the door, the boy, startled as if he would faint, tightly grabbed Russia's arm. His whole body trembled as he looked at the door with gleaming eyes. He finally looked around at the group and pleaded in an agonizing voice, "Please hide me." The group was stunned, not understanding the reason for this sudden plea. "Please, just hide me for a moment." The voice pleading again was tearful. Russia grabbed the boy's arm and asked, "What are you being chased by?" "Yes, there is someone trying to catch me." "You mean a policeman?" "No, please hide me quickly." Footsteps approached outside. The boy, not knowing what to do, stood up in his anxious mind and paced nervously. It was a sight unbearable to watch. The hearts of those watching burned. This was no time to hesitate. Where would be a good place to hide him? Under the blanket? That would be too foolish a hiding place. The group didn't know what to do in their anxiety and bewilderment. Quick-witted Russia sprang up and easily opened the closet on the opposite side. He nimbly lifted the boy, put him in the closet, and hurriedly closed the door. Sure enough, no sooner had the closet been closed than a loud cough was heard from outside, and the room door opened. The group looked out with tense hearts. It wasn't a policeman. A rough-bearded man in his 30s and a tall Chinese man stood outside the door and shamelessly surveyed the inside of the room without a word. They looked carefully, then looked again. Tilting their heads in thought, they looked in again with suspicious eyes. But ultimately, realizing their target was not there, the two chattered something for a long time, and finally the rough-bearded man looked at the people in the room and asked, "Didn't a boy wearing a cap come in here?" "No, he didn't." Without any hesitation, Russia answered sternly in one word, "Are you sure he didn't?" "I mean the boy wearing a cap and a suit." The suspicious man persistently asked once more, but Russia's consistent answer was stern enough to provoke antipathy. "I said he didn't come." The man, perhaps harboring anger at his thwarted expectations, glared at the room, closed the door, discussed something with the Chinese man, and left. The tension in the room finally eased. Those who had stood up straight relaxed and sat down. Relief finally came. "Are they all gone?" The boy opened the closet door and jumped out. He seemed quite relieved, but the anxious look had not yet completely disappeared. He didn't know how to express his gratitude to them, who were so kind to him. "Who on earth is that?" "He's my uncle." "Why are you being chased by your uncle?" The boy was silent for a long time. However, being asked so many times, he finally told the rough outline of his past and the circumstances from beginning to end in a tearful voice. His hometown was a seaside village in Huanghai province. Having lost the older brother he solely relied on a few years ago, he and his old mother inevitably had to rely on his uncle. The uncle was not well off to begin with and drank too much. Later, saying he was doing business or something, he borrowed a lot of money from a Chinese merchant in the village. Lacking the ability to pay it back, this became an increasingly heavy burden for him. Ultimately, left with no choice, he handed his nephew over to the Chinese man according to the Chinese man's demand. The Chinese man loaded the boy onto a ship and tried to take him into China. Inside the strange ship, the boy cried in fear and loneliness. Yet all the while, he was always looking for an opportunity to escape. It was when the ship anchored at a small island. The boy planned with peers of his age, sharing the same fate, and boldly attempted an escape. It was a dim moonlit night, the darkness deep, the sea black. Evading the terrifying eyes of the sailors, they were able to completely hide their bodies within the island. Thanks to the sympathy and goodwill of the islanders, when he crossed over to the west coast again on an island boat, the boy headed straight for Seoul. However, the Chinese man, already sensing this, tracked him down, dragging the uncle all the way to Seoul. He disguised himself perfectly with an old suit and a deep cap, but the quick-witted pursuers relentlessly chased after him. A home with nowhere to turn, a wicked uncle, a young boy, an ugly Chinese man, these are common occurrences. The group could not help but be shocked by the rugged fate of this young boy. "So eventually I ran all the way in here," the boy said as he wiped his tears. "Those guys from earlier, are they that uncle and the Chinese man?" "Yes, they are." Before the boy's answer even finished, lightning struck the room. The boy turned pale blue and seemed to turn to stone right there. The door opened like lightning, and the rough-bearded man from earlier and the Chinese man appeared once again. Their faces were distorted in anger, and the rough beard bristled like a chestnut burr. Swiftly, the man threw his body over the threshold and roughly grabbed the boy's arm and yanked him. "You wench, where do you think you're going if you leave?" The contradictory sound of calling the boy a wench suddenly shocked the room again. Everyone was dumbfounded, not even knowing what to say, and looked equally at the man and the boy. The man pulled the resisting boy completely towards him. Trembling with anger, he didn't know what to do. "You wicked girl, what's your plan running around hiding like this?" he said, fiercely striking the boy. With that force, the boy's deeply worn hat flew off, and the surprise of the people in the room was great. The thick hair that had been coiled up unraveled darkly. The frail boy suddenly transformed into a striking young woman. Fine eyebrows, a white forehead, black hair. Looking again, she was undeniably a striking young woman. The people in the room stared straight at her with doubtful eyes, as if unable to believe it. It was something that might happen in a medieval play, difficult to conceive of in reality. But no matter how much they looked, she was undeniably a striking young woman. "Just do as your uncle says. What kind of wicked behavior is this for a young wench? Huh?" The one called uncle scolded the young woman while looking at the Chinese man, as if it were an excuse directed at him. However, the young woman just cried without a word. "If you act like that, you'll just starve to death. What else can you do?" "I'd rather die. I don't want to go to a guy like that." Unable to hold back, the young woman retorted with a sobbing voice. "Still acting wicked. Think about your old mother at home." Saying that, the guy harshly dragged the young woman out. "You pathetic bastard." Russia, who had been keeping quiet, suddenly stood up and blindly punched the fellow, knocking him to the floor right there. Knocked down powerlessly by the unexpected attack, he got up again and fought back. As Russia's righteous indignation was great, and the man's momentum was fierce, the fight between the two was intense. Outside the door, a wave of people quickly formed. People in each room who had been asleep woke up to the untimely night disturbance, rubbing their tired eyes as they gathered. Later, even the clerk and the manager pushed through the crowd, but they too didn't know what to do. The fight became entangled. The people in the room didn't just watch. Numerous fists burning with the same righteous indignation flew over that wicked bastard and bastard deserving of death. The late-night lodging house was in chaos. Swept up in this dizzying chaos, the shadow of the Chinese man who had been standing there until now disappeared. The figure of the young woman was instantly gone from sight as well. Those fighting mindlessly barely realized it. When they realized that the fight they had fought up to now had amounted to nothing, thinking of the young woman who had been dragged away by the Chinese man, Russia's disappointment was great. The man covered entirely in blood also took advantage of this opening to sneakily run away. In this way, the lonely knight's lodging house had boiled over for a spell. It goes without saying that Russia and the young woman of that night were now the young man in Chinese clothes and the boy in the cap inside this train heading to Bongcheon. The young man, who absolutely needed a night's refuge due to the heavy duties he bore and had purposely sought out a remote lodging house, had thus come to know the young woman who had also come to hide to escape evil clutches. The train began to run forcefully. The young man, leaning next to the crowded seats, asked the boy, half glad but also doubtful, "How on earth did you escape from the Chinese man's hands?" The boy told every detail of what happened the previous night after that in a low voice. She explained in detail that as soon as she was dragged out onto the street by the Chinese man, she suddenly let out a loud scream, that she cried and appealed to the crowd gathering like a wave, and that while the crowd was holding the Chinese man and arguing, she slipped through the gaps of people and ran away. Then, looking at the young man as if embarrassed, "Right after that I went and even had my hair cut off." Then she took off the hat and showed her freshly cropped hair. The young man was quite surprised by the boy's bold and courageous heart. "But doing that, what on earth do you plan to do?" "I want to go far, far away." "What about your old mother?" "I want to see her, but if I go to the countryside, I will certainly be caught again." If Seoul is dangerous and my hometown is a place I cannot live, it's better to just go far, far away to an unfamiliar place. But if you go out aimlessly into the harsh world with a frail body, what will you do? The young man, feeling so sorry, looked at the boy with a gloomy face and said this, but it provided no light or help to the boy, who had already made up her mind to that extent. Leaving behind the beautiful 3,000-li garden where flowers bloom and pears ripen, being pushed out and chased away, our situation was already felt by the boy as Seoul is dangerous and my hometown is a place I cannot live. What more could the young man newly say? In the noisy train, silence flowed only between them. The train ran with passion. Carrying the noise, carrying life, carrying tragedy, it ran north. Ever north without rest. Listening to the sound of the running train, the young man's mind was full of thoughts of the boy. A frail young woman setting off on a journey into the rough world. Her spirit is brave and endearing, but eventually she will be a frail sailor swallowed by the jaws of the waves. That young sailor must be saved before the ship sails. However, even I, who think so, am in danger, unable to fathom my fate a moment from now. With what power can I save her? When his thoughts reached here, the young man's heart was sad. He also resented his own powerlessness. Ultimately, when he reached the conclusion he always arrived at, "Let's go out, let's work." Through the noise of the numerous crowd, the terrifyingly shining gaze of the country bumpkin suddenly clashed with the young man's eyes. The young man was startled. He awakened to his heavy duty and responsibility, which he had barely forgotten due to thoughts of the boy. The net of the mobile police was cast tightly without a gap. His responsibility, which he had to break through that net, was felt as heavy as 1,000 pounds. Wearing a changyi over a xiaomianyi, and over that a xiaogua, and again over that a magua, even in this attire, it seemed it could not guarantee his safety in front of the countless eyes shining ceaselessly. His hand instinctively went into the pocket of his xiaoma. Inside it were important documents and something to defend himself with in case of emergency. The touch of the weapon fitting snugly in his grasp was crisp and fresh. Taking his hand out of his pocket and turning his body, which had been facing out the dark window, back to this side, the young man's gaze met those snake-like eyes aiming at this side once more. He flinched unexpectedly. The sharp gaze of the short country bumpkin made him increasingly anxious. With a gloomy heart, he left the boy sitting in that seat, opened the door, and went out onto the deck. But it was packed with people there too. Through them those bizarre eyes shone as well. He returned to his seat. The train's speed gradually decreased, and blowing its whistle, it entered a station. The train rocked with people getting on and off. The country bumpkins also got off and exchanged places with new ones. Every time that happened, The young man felt these two contradictory emotions of relief and anxiety simultaneously. After those who were to get off got off, and those who were to get on got on, the train started moving again. The inside of the train was still crowded. As the young man narrowed his closed eyes and looked toward that corner under his dark glasses, he met those snake-like eyes from earlier once again. His heart pounded heavily. His hand instinctively went into his pocket again. He jumped up from his seat and went to the boy. Whether from fatigue or deep in thought, the boy, who was buried deep in her seat with her eyes closed, flashed her eyes open at the young man's voice. "It seems anxious to stay here. Let's go to the dining car." The young man took the boy and went through a couple of passenger cars to the dining car. The empty dining car was quiet and cool. He ordered tea and something to eat for the boy, and he gulped down beer with a heavy heart. The intoxication circulated through his whole body, but his mind became even clearer. In his clear mind, the present looked distinct anew. The anxious train, the boy and himself, the boy who must hide her natural gender, himself who must hide his nationality. As he gazed at them, his heart ached. Furthermore, looking at the young woman who had no choice but to cover her God-given gender with a bleak piece of a suit and even distort her dignified appearance, he could not hold back his tears for her, who was young like his own younger sister. Speaking of younger sisters, he also had a younger sister like the boy, and the boy also had an older brother like the young man. The young man suddenly remembered his sister for the first time in a long while. She had died long ago. She had starved and died of illness. A single injection would have saved her perfectly, but he was the one who couldn't even provide that. Thinking of that made his heart ache and his bones numb. He had merely suppressed that aching heart and numb bones with firm resolve. Outside the window, the darkness was deep, and the dining car shook lightly. Intoxicated by beer and thoughts, he barely discovered the new guests, two men who had set up camp at the table next to him. Eyes glaring fiercely this way, familiar eyes, they were the terrifying eyes that had been chasing him since earlier. The appearance of this dreadful country bumpkin threatened the young man just like the appearance of Javert in Hugo's work. Still, the young man remained calm and did not lose his composure. However, realizing that holding his ground there for long would be disadvantageous, he led the boy and stood up from the seat. Unexpectedly, something grabbed his shoulder firmly, and what firmly blocked his path was that country bumpkin. The young man felt a heaviness in his chest but calmly tried to shake off the front and go out. However, they grabbed the young man's arm. Things have finally happened. As soon as he felt it flash, he mustered all the courage and strength he had. Now that it has come to this, I'll have to give it all I've got, he thought, biting his teeth firmly. There was already nothing in front of him. He stretched his legs forcefully and headed toward the door like an arrow. They also hurriedly chased after him. Suddenly, the lights went out with a snap, and the dining car turned into pitch darkness. The boy, not knowing what was going on, held her breath in a corner and trembled in shock. In the pitch-black darkness, the sound of bodies clashing and rough breathing were heard. Man and man grappled, strength and strength collided. A fierce hand-to-hand fight had begun. There was a crashing sound, a falling sound, the sound of clothes ripping. Panting breaths were heard, screams rose. A table fell over, bottles and glasses shattered. Splintering glass fragments fluttered whitely in the darkness. Screams rose again, and a whistle blew. The train kept running. The sound of wheels on the rails swallowed the sound of the whistle. Suddenly, piercing the darkness of the train, a momentary spark flashed. The window broke and glass pieces flew. Gunpowder smoke rose. A gunshot shook the darkness. The train ran, and the night was dark. A second gunshot shattered the darkness. A person's scream rose, and the sound of someone collapsing into a seat was heard. As a third gunshot vibrated through the train again, the boy, trembling in fear in a corner, suddenly heard a single sentence from the young man's breathless voice right by her ear. "Let us meet again any time." The dining car door opened, and the agile shadow of a person disappeared outside like lightning. The storm had passed. The darkness was quiet again. The waiters, who had also been huddled in a corner, began to hurry, trembling with fear. As they flicked the switch, The inside of the car brightened again. It was a gruesome scene of carnage. Overturned tables, broken chairs, scattered glass pieces, shattered windows, torn clothes. Blood dripped on the floor, and in the middle of it, two men lay gruesomely collapsed with their noses buried. Realizing that neither was the young man, the boy felt relieved amidst the terror. But where on earth did he go? The boy searched for the young man's shadow and went outside. The train was in an uproar. People shuddered and whispered about this terrifying incident. The dining car was completely turned upside down. The engineer ran over and the conductor rushed in. The country bumpkins flocked in and the waiters were interrogated. The path between passenger cars was cut off and every single compartment was searched without a gap. But the young man's shadow was nowhere to be found. His whereabouts were a mystery. Returning to her seat in the passenger car and looking out the deep night window, the boy's heart was full of thoughts of the extraordinary young man. He was very kind to her. His sense of loyalty was clear. His chivalry burned like fire. His face was solemn, his strength was mighty, and his courage was like a fierce tiger. Thinking of this extraordinary young man, the boy suddenly recalled thoughts of her older brother, whom she had forgotten for a long time. He, too, wore unusual clothes and when in a hurry attached a mustache under his nose. He went to the snow-blowing northern countries and froze, and went to noisy China and gave speeches. He went to Russia, went to prison, and even fled from Seoul. Then, for several years now, his traces were faint, not knowing if he was dead or alive. According to rumors, some said he went to Brazil, others said he went to India, and there were also rumors that he went back to Russia. But she couldn't grasp which word was true. The thought of that older brother unexpectedly rose in the boy's heart. If that older brother had been in their hometown right now, this tragedy of hers would not have happened, and when she thought of this, the boy's eyes grew hot. She compared her older brother and the young man again. Whether in spirit or courage, how could they be so exactly alike? How happy I would be if that young man were my older brother right now. But he had vanished somewhere. Why did those imposing and wonderful people have to fight, hide, be chased, and disappear? The boy, who had grown up under the older brother who used to tell stories well when she was young, now properly grasped something. The train still ran. The inside of the train was still noisy and stirring. The eyes of the country bumpkins sparkled even more. However, to the boy, that looked endlessly foolish. The wise young man, the young man like a flying tiger, had already completely hidden his traces. He would by now be breaking a different path in a different place. Please, take care and go well. The boy blessed the young man's path ahead in her heart, and thinking of the young man's voice saying, "Let us meet again, anytime," she firmly made a courageous resolution in her heart, uncharacteristic of a young woman. In the meantime, I will also learn and know, so that when we meet again, I will show him a splendid figure of mine, worthy of holding hands and working together with him. Piercing the darkness, the train dashed. The distance of the darkness diminished moment by moment. The night was already looking toward the dawn. The resounding sound of the wheels violently running toward the new morning. It echoed in the boy's blood like a magnificent march. Piercing through the heavy darkness, the train finally greets the break of dawn. Just like the young man's promise to meet again, we too shall pass through the long tunnels of the night to meet a brighter morning. May the quiet courage you hold in your heart become your own beautiful march. Rest your weary mind, pull the blankets close, and let the night carry you away. Sweet dreams.